Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Janmadhyasya yato अन्वयादितरतश्च अर्थेषु अभिज्ञस्वराट् तेने ब्रह्महृदाय आदिकवये मुह्यन्ति यत्सूरयः तेजो वारिमृदां यथा विनिमयो यत्र त्रिसर्गो मृषा धाम्ना स्वेन सदा निरस्तकुहकं सत्यं परं धीमहि निगमकल्पतरोर्गलितं फलं शुकमुखादमृतद्रवसंयुतं पिबत भागवतं रसमालयं मुहुरहो रसिका भुवि भावुकाः. We now enter the 9th chapter of the 11th Skandha of Bhagavatam. So this is the continuation of Uddhava Gita and also the story of Dattatreya narrating his 24 gurus to Yadu Maharaj. So now he continues. He says, the source of all misery is attachment for something that one covets. Therefore, one who knows this and does not covet anything, does not get attached to anything, he is in everlasting happiness. He says, Parigraho hi dukkhaya yadyat priyatamam nranam anantam sukhamapnoti tad vidwan yastu akinchanaha. He says, whatever is considered to be very dear, by trying to acquire it, one gets suffering because either he is frustrated in acquiring it, or even if he acquires it, it doesn't last in this way. So he says, Anantam Sukham Apnoti. So the one who gets infinite happiness is the one who is not attached to anything. And here he gives the teaching that he received. This teaching he received from the Guru in the form of an osprey. Osprey is kind of like a hawk. It's a bird of prey that eats fish. So it is said that he once saw an osprey which had flesh in its mouth. That is, it had a fish in its mouth. And because it had a fish in its mouth, the other osprey started attacking it because the very possession of the fish made this osprey a target for other ospreys. The moment he dropped it, then they stopped attacking him and he was happy. So this showed him that if he possess something that others covet, then we face suffering from others as well. Not only do we have suffering because of our own attachment, but others also covet it and they cause suffering. So this is from the teaching of the osprey. Then he moves to the next guru, which is a child. He says, seeing a child, I learned to live without honor and dishonor. So people who are attached to household and so on, they have many worries, but I have no honor, no dishonor because I live like a child, wandering in the world, ever abiding in pure consciousness. He says, Name Manav Avamanav Stona Chinta Geha Putrinam Atma Krida Atmaratir Vicharamiha Balavat. So he says, just as a bala child, I go around with no care for honor or dishonor, and thereby I live always in bliss. And further he says, only two in this world are without any care and anxiety and always in bliss. One is the guileless child and the other is the true jnani who has transcended the three gunas. He says, Dvaveva chintaya muktau paramananda aplutau yo vimugdho jado balo yo gunebhyah param gatah. One who has gone past the three gunas and one who is a guileless child, they are both in Paramananda or supreme bliss. So this is what he learned from the child. Then he moves to the next teacher who is a young maiden, a young lady. So this young lady was once home and guests came to her house and she was alone. So she had to go and pound paddy in order to provide them food, make food for them. So when she started pounding paddy, the bangles on her wrists were making a loud sound and disturbing her as well as disturbing the guests who have come. So she didn't want to have that sound. So she removed the bangles one by one And finally, there were just two bangles on each wrist. And even then, she found that the two bangles were rubbing against each other and producing sound when she pounded the paddy. So then she removed the last one bangle too. So there was now only one bangle left instead of two, only one bangle in each wrist. And when there was only one bangle, it had nothing to make a sound with and it was quiet. So he says, I observed this and I learned that what is best to be shunned and what needs to be desired. He says, what needs to be shunned is unnecessary company, and what needs to be desired is solitude. Because when even there were two bangles, they started making a sound. Similarly, he says, even when there are two people, there is unnecessary talking and quarrel and so on. What to speak of many people, just as many bangles making too many sounds. But when the bangle became alone, it became very peaceful. Similarly, one ought to remain alone in solitude. So that's the lesson he learned from the lady, the maiden. Then he speaks of the arrow maker. So he says the purpose of life is to steady the mind. One has to steady the mind, the breath has to be regulated, the posture has to be regulated, and one has to live with a clear intellect and focus. He says, Mana ekatra samyujya ajita shwaso jitasanaha. He says, the way to live is to live in regulation. The breath is regulated, the posture is regulated, and mana ekatra samyujya means the mind is single pointed. It is completely in total attention. And when the mind is in that way, then it lets go of rajas and tamas, that is the mode of passion and ignorance, and it grows in sattva, in purity, and that purity results in realization. So he says, this single pointed focus I learned from the arrow maker. Because when an arrow maker is absorbed in his work, when he is making arrows, he was so absorbed that he did not even see the king passing by him. So there was a big procession of the king, but this arrow maker was there making arrows, and he didn't even bother turning and seeing who's going, all the commotion. He was so focused on his work, single pointed, that he was just doing the arrow making. So by seeing this, he says, I learned single pointed attention, and thereby, he says, the one who has such concentration on the pure self, he does not perceive anything inside or outside, just as the arrow maker didn't even perceive the king. Then he speaks of a serpent as a teacher. So he says, an ascetic who wanders alone ought to have no fixed abode. He can live in a mountain cave or some place like that, but he has to live without any fixed abode. And he also has to be very sparing of speech, because having one's own house for an ascetic is causing bondage and unnecessary suffering. So I learned this from a snake, because a snake, what it does is, a rat makes a hole in the ground and the snake just goes and enters it and stays there for some time and goes out. So he says, just like the snake, I also simply take refuge in whatever place is available as shelter that others have built and simply move around. Then he speaks of the spider. So here he gives the essence of the Supreme Being. He says the Supreme Being, he exists all by himself and he destroys the universe through his own energy of time, and he remains alone when the universe is dissolved. He says, Eko Narayano Deva Purvasrishtam Swamayaya Samhritya Kalakalaya Kalpanta Idamishwara. He says, Narayana, the Supreme Being, up through his own Maya, his own creation, he dissolves through his own energy called time. So he brings forth this universe from himself, sustains it in himself, and dissolves it by himself through his energy called time. Then he remains one alone, undifferentiated. He says, Eka eva advitiyo abhut atmadharo akhilashrayah. So the one who is pure self, one who is the refuge of the whole universe, he remains as one without a second. Eka eva advitiya. So one without a second. So after dissolving the universe, he remains one without a second, and the entire creation is merged in him, and he is the Lord of both matter and spirit, and he simply abides in his own state as the unconditioned supreme bliss. And then after that, he says, he then by his own power brings forth what is called Mahat, or the cosmic intelligence, which is like a thread, Sutra. And this thread, which is made of three colors, three gunas, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, is what makes the whole universe function, and it runs through the whole universe. So, just as a thread runs through a garland and keeps all the flowers together, similarly, this thread of cosmic intelligence runs through all created beings and holds them all together, holds the whole universe together. So, this principle I learned. So, the principle is, it is the one supreme being who brings forth the universe out of him as this cosmic intelligence, who maintains it like this thread, and then who dissolves it by his own energy of time unto himself and remains alone. So, all of this I learned by observing a spider. Because a spider, what it does is it spins a web out of its own mouth, and then it, after the web is spun, it is playing in it, and then after a while it swallows it back into its own mouth. So, by seeing this, I learned that this is how the Supreme Being brings the universe from himself, plays in it by himself, and dissolves it back unto himself. So, this I learned from the spider. And then finally, he learned from the wasp. So, he says when he observes a larva which is in fear of a wasp, it is said that just by this constant fear of the wasp, it becomes like the wasp. So he says, in similar sense, if the mind is focused on someone, even if it is out of fear, it becomes that person, attains that person. So this is what we saw in the principle of so many demons attaining liberation, such as Kamsa, Sishupala, and so on. They were obsessed in the fear of Krishna, and thereby they attained the eternal abode of Krishna. So he says, this I learned from the wasp. So in this way, he says these are all the 24 teachers he learned from. And not only that, on top of that, he says, I learned from my own body. I look at my own body and I see that the body is subject to birth and death, constantly changing, and thereby it is teaching me renunciation and discernment. Because the body is constantly changing, it is a source of many afflictions, old age, disease, and death, and so on. And therefore, by looking at it, I develop renunciation. So the body teaches me renunciation. I notice that the body ultimately belongs to the soil. It's going to go back to earth. It doesn't belong to me. There is no me, in fact. It is just the energy of the Supreme Being that is appearing as this body, and it dissolves back. So, not knowing this, people work hard simply to enjoy pleasures, and then they acquire many wives and servants and houses and so on, but then they all drag them in different directions. So he says the example is, it is similar to how the tongue drags one to one side. So if one is not regulated, the senses are all dragging in different directions. The tongue is dragging in one side, the thirst is dragging to another side, sexual impulse is dragging to another side, the stomach with hunger is dragging to another side, the sense of smell is dragging to another side, the eyes are dragging to another side, and so on. So this is how the one who is attached to the senses, all these various senses are dragging in different directions. This is similar to how a man with many wives, each wife is pulling him in a different direction. This is how it is. So he says, by observing this, I learned that the body can be tossed aside, torn up by being pulled in different directions if one is not regulated. Therefore, he says that the human body being very rare, the Supreme Being himself, having created all species, was most rejoiced to create the human body because it's capable of realizing the supreme truth. So, having attained the human body, one ought to strive for the supreme realization of the truth that all there is the Supreme Being, God alone is, and thereby attain true self realization. That is the purpose of life. Because if one is caught in sense pleasures, then it's no different from animals which are also engaging in the same. Then one is wasting the human life. So I learned this from my own body. So thus Dattatreya concludes his sermon to Yadu, and he says, therefore, by observing all these various gurus and learning from them, I freed myself from all attachment, and thereby I have the light of wisdom with which I wander in this world completely free. He says, Vicharami mahimeta mukta sango anahankritihi. I completely free of egotism. I wander in this world very happily in the light of knowledge, wisdom. And then he concludes by saying, such wisdom cannot be acquired by just one guru, because the Supreme Brahman is sung by different rishis in different ways, and each of them have their own value. He says, Nahi ekasmat guror jnanam susthiram syat supushkalam brahmaitad advitiyam vai giyate bahuda rishibihi. So many rishis have sung about the supreme truth in many ways, and so each of them have their own merit in listening to. So he says, one ought to be not simply attached to just one expression. He says it cannot be acquired by just one expression, but one can listen to various expressions. And in fact, as he showed in this discourse, various creatures, either even from a snake to a honeybee to elephant to serpent, all of them are teaching us various aspects of the truth. One who has got the eye can learn from anything. So that's why Dattatreya says, I have so many gurus. So after saying this, the Brahmana, the sage of deep wisdom, having spoken to King Yadu, and Yadu greeting him and offering him his obeisances, then Dattatreya left happily in his own way. And having listened to this discourse of Dattatreya, the king Yadu, who Krishna says is our own ancestor, he gained equanimity. He says, Avadhuta vachashrutva purvesham nah sa purvajah sarvasanga vinirmukta samachitto babhuvaha. So he is our purvaja. He says, Krishna is narrating this to Uddhava, as we know. This is Uddhava Gita. Last 3 chapters have been focused on the discourse of Dattatreya that Krishna is relating to Uddhava. And the discourse is given by Dattatreya to Yadu, who is the ancestor of Krishna himself. So Krishna says, my ancestor Yadu got this wonderful discourse from Dattatreya, from the Avadhuta, and thereby he got equanimity. Samachitta means equanimity. He got equanimity of mind, and equanimity is the true essence of yoga. As Krishna says in the Gita, Samatvam yoga uchyate. Yoga is exactly the same thing. Samachitta or Samatvam means equanimity is true yoga, is true realization. And that is what Yadu was blessed with by listening to Dattatreya. And with this chapter ends. We'll continue with Uddhava Gita, where Krishna continues instructing Uddhava on various aspects of self-realization, going forward with the next chapter. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.